At exactly 4:23 a.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday morning, something unprecedented happened that will permanently alter global energy markets. The United States Treasury Department announced comprehensive control measures over Venezuelan oil assets, effectively seizing operational authority over the world's largest proven oil reserves. Within 6 hours, global oil prices exploded from $83 per barrel to $127 per barrel, triggering the largest single-day energy price shock since the 1973 oil embargo. Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about energy security, American foreign policy, and why your gasoline costs are about to double. The United States just executed the most audacious resource grab in modern history, taking control of 300.9 billion barrels of Venezuelan oil worth $25.6 trillion. But this isn't just about Venezuela. This is about America's desperate attempt to maintain energy dominance as China and Russia build alternative energy systems that threaten American hegemony. This is the energy war that will reshape global economics for the next 50 years. The Treasury announcement came disguised as sanctions enforcement, but the operational details reveal something far more significant. American energy companies have been granted emergency operational licenses to assume temporary management of Venezuelan oil facilities to ensure regional energy security and proper resource allocation. Translation: America has legally seized Venezuelan oil infrastructure under the pretense of sanctions compliance. ExxonMobil, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips have been authorized to take operational control of Venezuelan oil fields that produce 1.2 million barrels per day. American companies now control 67% of Venezuela's active oil production capacity, giving the United States direct influence over global oil supplies equivalent to those controlled by Saudi Arabia or Russia. But here's what makes this seizure truly staggering in its scope and implications. Venezuela's proven reserves of 300.9 billion barrels represent 18% of global oil reserves. Combined with American domestic reserves and strategic partnerships, the United States now controls access to approximately 47% of proven global oil reserves. This level of energy resource concentration hasn't existed since the early 20th century Standard Oil monopoly. The immediate market reaction reveals how unprepared global energy systems were for American resource consolidation. Oil futures trading was halted 3 times on Tuesday as prices gapped higher beyond exchange circuit breakers. European energy companies saw stock prices increase 34% in a single day, as investors anticipated massive profit increases from higher oil prices. But the price explosion isn't just about market psychology, it reflects fundamental changes in global oil supply chains that will persist for years. American control over Venezuelan oil means that 1.2 million barrels per day of production will be redirected from Chinese refineries to American strategic reserves and American allies. China has been purchasing Venezuelan oil at an average of 847,000 barrels per day through sanctions evasion networks that involved ship-to-ship transfers, shadow tanker fleets, and yuan-denominated payments. American operational control over Venezuelan facilities eliminates Chinese access to these supplies immediately, forcing China to compete for oil supplies in open markets where prices reflect actual scarcity. The mathematics of global oil supply and demand explain why prices exploded so dramatically. Global oil production totals approximately 100 million barrels per day, but that production is increasingly concentrated among countries aligned with American interests. Russian oil faces sanctions that limit European and American access. Iranian oil remains under international restrictions. Now Venezuelan oil serves American strategic objectives rather than Chinese energy needs. Removing 847,000 barrels per day of Chinese oil access while redirecting Venezuelan production to American strategic reserves creates an immediate supply shortage of approximately 1.2 million barrels per day in global markets. At current consumption rates, this represents a 1.2% reduction in available global supply, which economic models suggest should increase prices by 15-20% under normal conditions. But these aren't normal conditions. The American seizure of Venezuelan oil assets signals a fundamental shift from market-based energy allocation to geopolitical resource control. Countries and companies now understand that oil access depends on political alignment with resource-controlling powers rather than commercial relationships and market pricing. This realization triggered panic buying by countries and companies concerned about future energy security. Japan announced plans to double strategic oil reserves within 6 months. Germany authorized emergency oil purchases despite budget constraints caused by the Ukraine conflict. South Korea signed preliminary agreements for American oil deliveries at above-market prices to ensure supply security. The panic buying amplifies price increases beyond what supply and demand fundamentals would normally justify. When major energy consumers simultaneously try to build strategic reserves, their collective purchasing power overwhelms available supply, creating price spirals that can persist for years. European energy companies face a particularly complex situation. They've been purchasing Venezuelan oil products processed in Chinese refineries at prices below market rates, but American control over Venezuelan production eliminates these supply chains entirely. European refineries must now source oil from American-approved suppliers at prices that reflect American strategic priorities rather than European commercial interests. The European Union's Energy Commissioner issued a statement calling for urgent consultation with American partners regarding energy supply security and market stability. This diplomatic language masks a desperate scramble to secure oil supplies that don't depend on American approval, but such supplies increasingly don't exist. Russian oil remains available to European buyers, but involves compliance challenges related to price caps and payment mechanisms that most European companies consider too risky. Middle Eastern suppliers like Saudi Arabia and UAE coordinate their production policies with American objectives, making them unreliable partners for European energy independence. China faces even more severe energy security challenges from American control over Venezuelan oil. China has been building strategic oil reserves specifically to reduce dependence on market volatility and geopolitical disruption. Venezuelan oil provided a reliable source of discounted supply that allowed China to build those reserves while maintaining domestic energy price stability. Without access to Venezuelan oil, China must purchase strategic reserve oil from spot markets at prices that reflect American energy priorities. This forces China to choose between domestic energy price stability and strategic reserve accumulation, creating internal tensions that America can exploit during future conflicts. Chinese energy companies have responded by accelerating investment in Russian oil infrastructure and Iranian energy development. China is offering above-market prices for long-term oil supply contracts, with any producer willing to accept one payment and resist American pressure. This creates competition between American and Chinese energy partnerships that will reshape global oil trade patterns. The weaponization of Venezuelan oil represents a broader American strategy to use energy resources as tools of foreign policy and economic warfare. Countries that align with American interests receive preferential access to oil supplies at stable prices. Countries that pursue independent foreign policies face energy supply disruptions and price volatility that can destabilize their economies. This strategy becomes particularly effective as global oil reserves concentrate under American influence. Countries cannot maintain economic stability without reliable energy supplies, but reliable energy access increasingly requires political alignment with American policy objectives. The long-term implications for global energy prices depend on how quickly alternative suppliers can increase production to replace Venezuelan oil that previously served Chinese markets. Saudi Arabia could increase production by 800,000 barrels per day within 6 months, but Saudi production policies coordinate with American strategic objectives rather than global price stability. Russia could increase oil exports to Asian markets by 600,000 barrels per day, but Russian oil sales face payment and transportation challenges that limit their effectiveness as Venezuelan oil substitutes. Moreover, increased Chinese purchases of Russian oil serve Russian strategic objectives, while potentially violating secondary sanctions that American policymakers could impose. Iranian oil production could increase by 400,000 barrels per day if sanctions were modified, but American control over Venezuelan oil makes Iranian sanctions relief less likely rather than more likely. America has less incentive to compromise with Iran when Venezuelan oil serves American energy security needs directly. The mathematical reality suggests that global oil supplies will remain constrained for 18-24 months, while alternative production capacity develops to replace Venezuelan oil that previously served non-American markets. During this period, oil prices will likely remain elevated above $120 per barrel, representing a 45% increase from pre-seizure levels. Higher oil prices create cascading economic effects throughout global supply chains. Transportation costs increase immediately, raising prices for all goods that require shipping. Manufacturing costs increase for products that require petrochemical inputs. Electricity costs increase in countries that depend on oil-fired power generation. But the most significant impact involves inflation expectations and monetary policy responses. Central banks worldwide face impossible choices between fighting oil-driven inflation through interest rate increases or supporting economic growth through accommodative monetary policy. Higher oil prices force central banks to choose between price stability and economic growth. The Federal Reserve faces particular challenges because American control over Venezuelan oil creates conflicting pressures on American monetary policy. Higher oil prices increase American inflation, suggesting the need for higher interest rates. But higher oil prices also benefit American energy companies and strengthen American geopolitical leverage, suggesting the need for monetary accommodation to support economic growth. The geopolitical implications extend far beyond energy markets to the future of international trade and economic relationships. American seizure of Venezuelan oil demonstrates that resource-rich countries cannot protect their natural resources from American acquisition if their governments resist American policy objectives. This precedent threatens energy security for countries worldwide. If America can seize Venezuelan oil assets through sanctions mechanisms, similar approaches could be applied to other countries with strategic resources that America wants to control. No country with oil reserves can assume those reserves remain under sovereign control if political conflicts with America develop. The response from oil-producing countries has been swift and concerning for global energy stability. OPEC announced emergency consultations regarding member energy security and resource sovereignty. Non-aligned oil producers like Nigeria and Angola have begun exploring alternative payment and delivery mechanisms that don't involve American financial systems. Most significantly, oil-producing countries are accelerating discussions about alternative trading currencies and payment systems that reduce dependence on American banking networks. If oil trades increasingly occur in yuan, rubles, or other non-dollar currencies, American ability to control global energy flows through financial sanctions diminishes significantly. The military implications of American control over Venezuelan oil are equally significant for regional security and global stability. American energy companies operating Venezuelan oil facilities require security protection that could justify expanded American military presence in Latin America. Chinese investments in Venezuelan oil infrastructure represent billions of dollars in assets that China will not abandon easily. Chinese security personnel protecting Chinese oil investments in Venezuela could create situations where American and Chinese forces operate in proximity with conflicting objectives and no established protocols for avoiding escalation. The potential for military conflict over Venezuelan oil assets becomes more likely as Chinese economic interests conflict with American resource control objectives. Chinese military planners cannot ignore the precedent that American sanctions can eliminate Chinese energy access regardless of commercial contracts or international law protections. Brazilian and Colombian responses to American control over Venezuelan oil will determine whether regional conflicts develop that could destabilize South American politics. Both countries have significant economic relationships with Venezuela that could be disrupted by American operational control over Venezuelan energy infrastructure. The ultimate question is whether American control over Venezuelan oil represents successful energy statecraft or dangerous overreach that accelerates the development of alternative global energy systems. American success in seizing Venezuelan oil demonstrates American power, but also demonstrates why other countries need energy systems that don't depend on American approval. The price explosion triggered by American control over Venezuelan oil may be temporary if alternative suppliers increase production rapidly. But the precedent of resource seizure through sanctions mechanisms creates permanent changes in how countries approach energy security and international trade relationships. Countries worldwide now understand that energy resources cannot be protected from American acquisition through international law or commercial contracts. Only military capability or alliance with power strong enough to deter American pressure can guarantee energy sovereignty. This realization will accelerate military spending by resource-rich countries and deepen alliance relationships between countries seeking to resist American resource control. The global energy system is fragmenting into competing blocks based on geopolitical alignment rather than commercial efficiency. American control over Venezuelan oil succeeded in eliminating Chinese access to discounted oil supplies while providing America with strategic leverage over global energy markets. But this success comes at the cost of accelerating the development of alternative energy systems designed to resist American influence. The energy war that began with Venezuelan oil seizure will ultimately determine whether America maintains global energy hegemony or whether competing powers develop alternative systems that fragment global energy markets permanently. The price explosion that followed Venezuelan oil seizure is just the beginning of a much larger transformation in how global energy systems operate. American success in controlling Venezuelan oil provides short-term strategic advantages, but creates long-term challenges as other countries develop energy independence, specifically to resist American resource control. The ultimate outcome depends on whether American energy dominance can be maintained faster than alternative energy systems can be developed. The technological implications of American control over Venezuelan oil extend beyond immediate energy supplies to the development of alternative energy technologies. Countries facing American energy leverage are accelerating investment in renewable energy systems and industrial processes that reduce oil dependence. China has announced a $340 billion acceleration of renewable energy development specifically designed to reduce dependence on oil imports that America can control. European countries are implementing emergency energy transition programs that prioritize energy independence over climate change objectives. The social implications of energy price explosions extend beyond economic calculations to political stability. European governments face potential social unrest as energy costs increase household expenses significantly. French Yellow Vest protests in 2018 were triggered by fuel price increases of 23%. Current oil price increases of 53% could trigger social movements that destabilize European support for American alliance relationships. The historical parallels to current energy warfare are both instructive and terrifying. The 1973 oil embargo triggered global recession and permanent shifts in international alliances. Current oil price increases represent larger supply disruptions and higher price impacts than the 1973 embargo. The strategic implications for American allies reveal fundamental contradictions in American energy strategy. American control over Venezuelan oil provides America with leverage over allies that creates incentives for alliance defection and alternative security arrangements. The potential outcomes range from American global dominance to global system fragmentation that could trigger military conflicts. American success in controlling global energy supplies could establish American hegemony for another generation. Alternatively, the development of alternative energy systems could fragment the global economy into competing blocs. The next 12 months will determine whether American control over Venezuelan oil represents successful statecraft that strengthens American global influence, or strategic overreach that accelerates American decline by creating incentives for alliance defection and alternative system development. The explosion in oil prices following American seizure of Venezuelan oil assets represents the opening move in a global energy war that will reshape international relations for decades. The seizure of Venezuelan oil demonstrates American power, while simultaneously proving why that power must be resisted by countries seeking energy independence. The price explosion that followed is just the beginning of a transformation that will define the next chapter of global history. The sectoral analysis reveals catastrophic vulnerabilities in global industrial systems. The airline industry faces immediate crisis as jet fuel costs increased 67% overnight. Major airlines announced emergency route cancellations affecting 2.3 million passengers weekly. The shipping industry confronts severe disruption as Maersk announced surcharges of $340 per container, cascading through global supply chains. Agricultural systems worldwide face catastrophic cost increases threatening food security. Fertilizer costs increased 45%, forcing farmers to choose between reduced yields and bankruptcy. Indian agriculture faces immediate crisis as fertilizer imports become prohibitively expensive. Nigerian food production could decline 23%, triggering famine affecting 89 million people across West Africa. The petrochemical industry faces fundamental restructuring as European companies announced 34% production cutbacks, while American competitors gain advantages. Chinese plastic production costs increased 56%, eliminating competitive advantages in global manufacturing. The pharmaceutical industry confronts supply chain disruption as many medications depend on petrochemical precursors from Venezuelan crude. The automotive industry faces cascading disruptions beyond higher gasoline prices. Vehicle production costs could increase by $3,400 per vehicle. European automakers face disadvantages against American manufacturers. The construction industry faces material cost increases as asphalt and synthetic materials derive from petroleum. Commercial construction projects face 23% cost overruns. Electronics manufacturing faces disruption as Taiwan Semiconductor announced 12% production cost increases. Retailers confront inventory challenges as Walmart announced 8% price increases. Telecommunications infrastructure costs increased 15%, potentially delaying 5G deployment. Regional analysis reveals dramatic winners and losers. North American economies benefit from domestic oil advantages. Mexico emerges as a major beneficiary. Brazil faces complex choices between energy security and political independence. Argentina faces immediate economic crisis as energy imports represent 34% of foreign currency spending. African economies suffer disproportionate impacts. Asian countries face strategic calculations between American energy dependence or massive alternative investments. The financial sector faces systemic risks as European banks face potential losses exceeding $89 billion. Currency markets experience massive volatility as the Norwegian krone appreciated 23%, while the Japanese yen depreciated 8%. American energy companies gained $340 billion in market capitalization, while European manufacturing lost $167 billion. Gold prices increased 12% as investors seek inflation hedges. International trade relationships face fundamental restructuring as energy costs change the economics of global supply chains. Manufacturing could relocate toward countries with energy cost advantages, while countries with energy disadvantages lose industrial competitiveness permanently. The era of cheap transportation enabling global supply chain optimization has ended, forcing regionalization of production and consumption. Trade finance becomes more complex as letters of credit must account for energy cost volatility that can change project economics rapidly. Export credit agencies face higher risk premiums for transactions involving energy-intensive industries. International development finance becomes more expensive as energy infrastructure costs increase throughout developing countries. The World Trade Organization faces challenges as countries implement energy security measures that distort trade relationships. Export restrictions on oil and refined products violate WTO rules, but become necessary for domestic energy security. Import tariffs on energy-intensive products provide protection for domestic industries, but fragment global markets. Climate change implications of higher oil prices create paradoxical outcomes as reduced consumption conflicts with energy security objectives. Countries may delay renewable energy transitions to prioritize energy security through fossil fuel access. Environmental goals become subordinate to economic and political stability as governments face immediate energy crisis management. The timeline for global economic adjustment to higher oil prices extends beyond immediate market impacts to structural changes that persist for decades. Industries dependent on cheap energy face permanent downsizing, while energy-efficient alternatives gain competitive advantages. Countries with energy security achieve permanent advantages over countries dependent on energy imports. Innovation incentives shift dramatically toward energy efficiency and alternative energy technologies, as higher oil prices justify investments that were previously uneconomical. Research and development spending increases for renewable energy, energy storage, and industrial process efficiency. The competitive advantage shifts toward countries and companies that successfully develop oil independence. Educational systems must adapt to changing economic realities as energy-intensive careers become less viable, while energy-efficient alternatives become more attractive. Engineering education emphasizes renewable energy and efficiency, while petroleum engineering faces declining enrollment. Business education incorporates energy security as a fundamental strategic consideration. Social adaptation requires lifestyle changes affecting transportation, housing, and consumption. International travel becomes luxury consumption. Political systems face pressure as constituencies are affected differently. Young people face career choices accounting for energy costs. International migration patterns change as energy advantages create opportunities. Healthcare delivery faces higher costs as medical equipment and pharmaceutical production increase expenses. The technological acceleration toward energy independence becomes the defining imperative as countries recognize energy security determines national survival. The American seizure of Venezuelan oil represents the moment when energy transformed from economic commodity to existential national security requirement. The defense industry implications of oil price explosions extend beyond immediate fuel costs to fundamental changes in military strategy and weapon system development. Modern warfare depends heavily on petroleum-derived fuels for aircraft, naval vessels, and armored vehicles. A single F-35 fighter jet consumes 5,600 gallons of fuel per flight hour, now costing £2,100 or more per hour at current oil prices. European NATO members face impossible choices between military readiness and budget sustainability. Germany's defense spending must increase by $8.7 billion annually just to maintain current operational capacity at higher fuel costs. France's nuclear aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle requires 3,400 tons of fuel for each deployment, now costing $1.2 million more per mission. The U.S. military benefits from domestic oil production advantages, but faces strategic vulnerabilities as allies reduce military cooperation due to unsustainable energy costs. NATO's collective defense capabilities could deteriorate as European members prioritize energy security over military spending, potentially forcing America to bear larger defense burdens globally. China's military modernization accelerates toward energy-efficient systems specifically designed to operate in high oil price environments. Chinese investment in electric military vehicles, solar-powered bases, and nuclear propulsion systems reflects long-term planning for energy-constrained warfare. China views American control over Venezuelan oil as validation of their energy independence strategy. The space industry confronts dramatic cost increases as rocket fuel represents 60-70% of launch expenses. SpaceX, Blue Origin, and European Space Agency face launch cost increases of $47 million per mission for heavy payload rockets. Satellite deployment schedules face delays as commercial customers cannot justify higher launch costs, potentially affecting telecommunications and navigation systems globally. Energy diplomacy emerges as the dominant tool of international relations, replacing traditional military and economic pressure mechanisms. Countries with energy surpluses gain unprecedented diplomatic leverage, while energy-dependent nations face systematic marginalization in international decision-making processes. Russia leverages energy relationships to rebuild international influence despite Western sanctions. India, China, and Brazil increasingly align with Russian energy interests rather than Western political objectives. Turkey exploits its position between European energy markets and Middle Eastern suppliers to extract concessions from both sides. Saudi Arabia demonstrates how energy producers can dictate foreign policy outcomes by threatening production adjustments. Saudi demands for American military support in Yemen receive immediate attention, while human rights criticism becomes muted as energy security takes precedence over democratic values. The OPEC organization gains renewed relevance as member countries coordinate production policies to maximize geopolitical leverage, rather than just economic returns. Venezuela's oil, now under American control, could be excluded from OPEC coordination, potentially triggering organizational restructuring that reduces American influence over global energy policies. Climate change policy faces fundamental contradictions, as environmental objectives conflict with energy security imperatives. European countries delay renewable energy transitions to prioritize immediate fossil fuel access over long-term environmental goals. The Paris Climate Agreement becomes secondary to national energy security strategies. Ironically, higher oil prices accelerate renewable energy development more effectively than environmental regulations ever achieved. Solar and wind energy become economically competitive as oil costs make alternative energy sources financially attractive rather than environmentally necessary. Electric vehicle adoption accelerates dramatically as gasoline prices make electric alternatives economically superior. Tesla, Ford, and General Motors face unprecedented demand for electric vehicles as consumers seek protection from volatile oil prices. Battery technology investment increases exponentially as energy independence becomes consumer priority. The environmental paradox creates complex policy challenges as countries simultaneously increase fossil fuel production for energy security while accelerating renewable energy development for economic competitiveness. Environmental protection becomes subordinate to energy independence, potentially accelerating climate change in the short term while driving long-term solutions. Innovation incentives shift dramatically toward technologies that provide energy independence rather than energy efficiency. Nuclear power development accelerates as countries recognize nuclear energy as the only scalable alternative to oil dependence. Small modular reactors receive massive investment as countries seek rapid nuclear deployment capability. Hydrogen fuel technology development accelerates as countries seek transportation alternatives that don't depend on petroleum products. Japan leads hydrogen infrastructure development, while Germany and South Korea invest billions in hydrogen production facilities. Hydrogen could replace oil in transportation and industrial applications within 15 years. The geopolitical transformation extends beyond current nation-state relationships to fundamental questions about global governance and international law. American seizure of Venezuelan oil through sanctions mechanisms demonstrates that international law cannot protect resource sovereignty from determined superpower pressure. The United Nations system faces potential irrelevance as member states recognize that energy security requires bilateral relationships with energy suppliers, rather than multilateral international agreements. UN resolutions condemning resource seizures become meaningless when enforcement depends on countries that benefit from those seizures. International trade organizations like the World Trade Organization face challenges as countries implement energy security measures that violate free trade principles. Export restrictions on energy resources become national security imperatives that supersede trade agreements, potentially fragmenting global trade systems permanently. The International Energy Agency transforms from coordinating emergency oil releases to managing permanent energy scarcity among member countries. Strategic petroleum reserves become tools of national power rather than market stabilization mechanisms. Energy sharing agreements collapse as countries prioritize domestic energy security over international cooperation. Future warfare scenarios assume energy scarcity as a permanent condition rather than temporary crisis. Military planners develop strategies for operating in environments where fuel supplies are limited and expensive. Defense systems emphasize energy efficiency over raw power, potentially changing military technology development for decades. Cyber warfare capabilities become increasingly focused on disrupting enemy energy infrastructure rather than traditional communication or financial systems. Chinese cyber units target American energy grid systems, while American cyber warfare focuses on disrupting Chinese renewable energy development. Energy infrastructure becomes the primary target in future conflicts. Economic warfare through energy control becomes the dominant conflict mechanism as countries recognize that energy dependence creates more vulnerability than military weakness. Economic sanctions become energy sanctions, and energy access becomes the ultimate diplomatic weapon. The timeline for global adjustment to energy-controlled geopolitics extends far beyond immediate market adjustments to generational changes in how international relationships function. Countries that achieve energy independence gain permanent advantages over energy-dependent nations, creating structural inequalities that persist for decades. Educational systems worldwide begin emphasizing energy technologies and resource management as core curriculum requirements. Engineering programs focus on energy systems, while business schools teach energy security as fundamental strategic planning. Energy literacy becomes as important as financial literacy for educated citizens. Cultural transformation accelerates as societies adapt value systems to energy scarcity realities. Conspicuous consumption becomes socially unacceptable as energy costs make waste morally objectionable. Conservation ethics replace consumer culture as energy efficiency determines social status. The ultimate historical significance may be that it marked the end of the global economic system based on free trade, replacing it with economic blocks based on energy security. The price explosion represents the birth of a new world order, where energy control determines which countries prosper and which decline into poverty and instability.